The lunchroom at Roosevelt High School buzzed with the usual teenage chaos. A mix of laughter, conversations, and the clatter of trays being shuffled across tables. It was a typical fall day in Cincinnati, Ohio. The kind where the sun's warmth filtered through the large cafeteria windows, casting golden streaks on the floors. Among the students, groups have formed naturally over time. Athletes, theater kids, and everyone else carving out their familiar spaces. But in one quieter corner near the windows sat Brielle, a 16-year-old girl who had grown accustomed to being overlooked, yet always noticed for the wrong reasons. Brielle loved sitting by the windows, where she could watch the breeze rustle through the campus courtyard trees. It was her little escape, a place where she could be present without fully engaging in the noise around her. She had learned early in life how to blend into the background, how to smile softly, how to listen without drawing attention, and most importantly, how to shield herself from the unkindness that sometimes came her way. Being one of the few black students in a predominantly white school had taught her resilience, but it also meant she was constantly aware of the eyes that lingered too long, the whispers she wasn't supposed to hear, and the subtle ways she was made to feel different. As she unpacked her lunch, a steaming container of homemade jambalaya that still carried the warmth of home, Brielle's attention drifted to the hum of the cafeteria. Conversations floated by in bits and pieces. A recap of last weekend's football game, whispers about an upcoming party, and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby table. It was the kind of background noise she had learned to tune out. She wasn't expecting trouble today, though trouble had a way of finding her when she least expected it. Across the room, a group of juniors had gathered at a table, their laughter louder than usual. Jason, the self-proclaimed leader of their pack, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. Beside him, Mia, his ever-present sidekick, giggled at whatever joke he had just made. Brielle didn't need to look up to know they were talking about someone. She could feel the weight of their attention shifting in her direction. She stayed focused on her food, hoping to avoid whatever was coming. Too dark, right? Jason's voice cut through the chatter, deliberately loud enough for the room to hear. You'd think she'd figure it out by now. The words sliced through the air, sharper than any knife. Brielle froze mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air as her mind raced to process what she had just heard. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. This wasn't the first time she'd heard something like this, and she had learned to mask her emotions, to bury the sting deep where it wouldn't show. Still, something about today felt different. The laughter at Jason's table grew louder, emboldened by the silence that followed his remark. Mia tried to suppress a snicker, but failed, while a few other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Most, however, chose the easier route, pretending they hadn't heard anything. Brielle could feel the stares, some curious, others amused, but none offering her the support she silently wished for. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Jason's across the room. He smirked, clearly enjoying the attention and the discomfort he had caused. Beside him, Mia glanced away, her grin faltering for a moment before she returned to fiddling with her phone. Brielle's heart raced, her mind torn between two options. Ignore it and let the moment pass, or stand up and confront him. Jason leaned forward, his smirk widening as he saw her hesitation. What's wrong, Brielle? Cat got your tongue. His words dripped with mockery, each syllable designed to provoke. The cafeteria seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum of conversation fading into an almost eerie silence. Students paused mid-sentence, mid-bite, waiting to see what Brielle would do. Even the lunch monitors, usually indifferent to teenage drama, glanced toward the commotion, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Brielle's grip tightened around her fork, her knuckles turning white. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a reminder to always stay poised, to never let them see her break. But today, something inside her shifted. The weight of all the times she had swallowed her hurt, all the times she had let cruel words slide, pressed heavily on her chest. Today, she decided, would be different. Slowly, deliberately, Brielle set her fork down. The scrape of her chair against the tiled floor was sharp and intentional as she stood, drawing the full attention of the room. She pushed her lunch aside, her movements measured, her expression calm. But inside, a fire burned. A fire that had been ignited by years of feeling like she had to shrink herself just to exist. Jason's smirk faltered for a split second before returning, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. "Oh, she's standing up," he said, his voice laced with mock surprise. "What's it gonna be?" Brielle got something to say. Brielle took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, but carried an edge that cut through the room like a blade. "Is that what you think honesty looks like, Jason?" Hiding behind cheap insults and a laugh track. The room fell into an even deeper silence. All eyes were on Brielle now, her figure framed by the sunlight streaming through the window. Jason's smirk faded completely, replaced by a hint of confusion. He had expected her to stay quiet, to look away, to let his words linger unchecked. What he hadn't expected was for her to fight back. "You think you're brave," Brielle continued, her voice steady. "Sitting there with your little entourage, tearing people down because it makes you feel bigger? That's not bravery, Jason. That's cowardice." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His confidence was crumbling, the cracks in his bravado visible to everyone in the room. Brielle took a step closer, her gaze unwavering, her presence commanding. "You want to make fun of my skin," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the cafeteria. "Go ahead. But let me tell you what you don't get. My skin, it's not just beautiful, it's powerful. It carries history, resilience, strength. You don't get to decide its worth, and you definitely don't get to make me feel ashamed of it." The cafeteria was completely still, every student hanging on her words. Even the air seemed charged with electricity, the weight of her stand pressing down on everyone present. Brielle's voice softened slightly, but her intensity remained. "You try to tear people down because you're afraid of what you don't understand. But here's the truth, Jason. You don't have power over me. You never did." Jason sat frozen, his usual smugness gone. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos of just moments ago. Brielle's words hung in the air, resonating far beyond the cafeteria walls. For a moment, no one moved. Then from somewhere in the room, a slow clap began, hesitant at first, but quickly gaining momentum. The sound grew, spreading like a ripple, until the entire cafeteria seemed to echo with applause. But Brielle didn't linger in the moment. She turned back to her table, her steps steady, her head held high. Inside, her heart pounded with adrenaline, but she refused to let it show. She had said what needed to be said, and she wouldn't give Jason, or anyone else, the satisfaction of seeing her falter. As she sat down and picked up her fork, the buzz of conversation began to return to the cafeteria. But the atmosphere was different now. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Brielle had done more than stand up for herself. She had sparked something larger, something no one in that room would forget anytime soon. Yet, as Brielle took another bite of her lunch, her hands still trembling slightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As Brielle stirred her jambalaya absent-mindedly, the echo of applause still ringing faintly in her ears, she couldn't help but feel the weight of every eye in the cafeteria. Some students whispered in hushed tones, their heads turning in her direction before darting away. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. Brielle kept her gaze down, focusing on her food and trying to steady her breathing. Her hands still trembled slightly, adrenaline of her confrontation with Jason lingering in her system. The cafeteria felt like a different place now. The energy had shifted, palpable, electric, but Brielle wasn't sure if it was in her favor. She didn't regret what she'd said. It needed to be said, not just for herself, but for anyone else who'd ever felt small because of someone like Jason. Still, the uncertainty of what would come next gnawed at her. Standing up for yourself was one thing, but dealing with the aftermath was a whole other challenge. And Brielle knew Jason wasn't the kind of person to let something like this slide. Across the room, Jason sat stiffly at his table, his shoulders tense, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. His friends, who had been laughing moments before, now looked at him uneasily, unsure of how to react. Mia leaned in to whisper something to him, but he waved her off, his jaw clenched. It was clear he wasn't used to being called out, especially not in front of a crowd. His pride had taken a hit, and Brielle could tell he was already plotting his next move. Brielle glanced around the room, catching snippets of conversations as students leaned in close to each other, their voices low but animated. "Did you hear what she said? I mean, wow." Jason had it coming, though. He's always running his mouth. I didn't know Brielle had it in her. That was intense. A part of her wanted to feel proud, to let their words boost her confidence. But another part of her felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had spent so much of her life trying to stay invisible, to avoid the kind of attention that now surrounded her like a spotlight. It wasn't that she didn't believe in what she'd said. She did, with every fiber of her being. But standing up had come at a cost, and she wasn't sure she was ready to pay it. As the lunch period dragged on, Brielle's mind drifted to the moments that had shaped her, the experiences that had given her the strength to speak out. She thought of her mother, who always seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders with grace and determination. Growing up, Brielle had watched her mother face countless challenges, racism, financial struggles, and the daily grind of raising a family on her own. But she had never once seen her falter. "Your skin is your armor," her mother would say, brushing a hand gently against Brielle's cheek. "It's a gift, a reflection of all the strength and beauty that came before you. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words had stayed with Brielle, even on the hardest days, when the whispers and stares felt like too much to bear. They had given her the courage to hold her head high, even when it felt like the world was trying to push her down. And today, they had given her the strength to stand up to Jason, to remind herself, and everyone else, that she was worth more than their judgments. But the truth was, being strong wasn't always easy. There were days when Brielle felt the weight of her differences like a heavy cloak, days when she wished she could just bend in, disappear into the background like everyone else. She thought about the first time she felt truly out of place back in middle school, when a girl named Lily had made a fun comment about her hair being too wild. It had been a small remark, almost casual, but had stayed with Brielle, planting a seed of self-doubt that took years to uproot. In many ways, Jason's comment today had felt like a culmination of all those little moments, the stares, the whispers, the casual insults that were dismissed as jokes. But instead of letting it break her, she had decided to fight back. And now, sitting alone at her table, she wondered if she'd made the right choice. The bell rang, jolting Brielle from her thoughts. Students began to gather their things, their conversations shifting to the usual chatter about classes and after-school plans. Brielle took her time packing up, hoping to avoid the rush and the inevitable stares that would follow her out the door. As she slung her bag over her shoulder and stood, she felt a hand on her arm. "Brielle." The voice was soft, almost hesitant. She turned to see Ava, a girl from her history class, standing beside her. Ava was quiet, not someone Brielle knew well, but her wide brown eyes were filled with something that looked like admiration. "What you said back there, it was amazing. I just wanted you to know that." Brielle blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, thanks, Ava." Ava smiled, a small but genuine expression, before disappearing into the crowd. Brielle stood there for a moment, watching the students file out of the cafeteria. Her heart felt a little lighter, the knot of anxiety in her chest loosening ever so slightly. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. As she made her way to her next class, Brielle couldn't shake the feeling that Jason wasn't done with her yet. The look in his eyes as she'd spoken, it wasn't just embarrassment or anger. It was something deeper, something darker. And though she didn't want to admit it, it scared her. Jason wasn't used to losing, and Brielle had a sinking feeling that he wouldn't let this go without a fight. By the time she reached her English classroom, the whispers had followed her like a shadow. Students turned to look at her as she walked in, their faces a mix of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite place. Her teacher, Mrs. Connors, greeted her with a warm smile, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing in the hallways. "Take your seats, everyone," Mrs. Connors called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. "We're continuing our discussion on symbolism today." Brielle slid into her usual seat by the window, grateful for the brief reprieve that class offered. She opened her notebook, trying to focus on Mrs. Connors' lecture, but her mind kept drifting back to the cafeteria. The way Jason had looked at her, the way the room had gone silent, the applause that had followed. It all felt surreal, like a scene from a movie she hadn't meant to star in. Halfway through the class, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced around to make sure Mrs. Connors wasn't looking before sliding it out and unlocking the screen. A single text lit up the screen, the sender unknown. "You think you're so brave? Let's see how brave you are when the tables turn." Brielle's stomach dropped. She stared at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. She had a pretty good idea who it was from, but the thought of Jason, or anyone, going out of their way to intimidate her sent a chill down her spine. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, her mind racing. She had known standing up to Jason would come with consequences, but she hadn't expected them to come so quickly. And as much as she tried to push the fear aside, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that this was only the beginning. Brielle's hand trembled as she gripped her pencil, her mind far from the worksheet in front of her. The text replayed in her head, each word cutting deeper than the last. She knew Jason was behind it. No one else had the same smug arrogance to try and scare her anonymously. It was a move meant to rattle her, and she hated to admit it was working. Her breathing quickened as she tried to refocus on Mrs. Connor's lecture. But the words blurred together on the page. At the back of the classroom, Jason sat slouched in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Brielle avoided looking directly at him, but she could feel his presence like a heavy weight pressing down on her. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore, his disdain, his anger. Every time she shifted in her seat, it was as if his eyes followed her, watching, waiting. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but what would that solve? He thrived on reactions, on the power he could wield over others. Giving him the satisfaction wasn't an option. By the time the bell rang, Brielle was on edge. She hurried out of the classroom, clutching her backpack tightly as she navigated the crowded hallways. Her plan was to find a quiet corner somewhere, anywhere, to gather her thoughts. But as she turned the corner toward the library, a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. "Hey, Brielle." She turned slowly to find Tasha, her closest friend, driving up to her. Tasha's curly hair bounced as she moved, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. Brielle had avoided her since lunch, not ready to explain everything that had happened. But now, standing face to face, she realized she couldn't dodge her friend forever. "Hey," Brielle said, her voice quieter than she intended. Tasha studied her closely, her brow furrowing. "What's going on?" "You've been acting weird all day." Brielle hesitated. She wasn't sure how much to share, not because she didn't trust Tasha, but because saying it out loud made it all feel too real. Finally, she sighed and leaned in closer. "Jason sent me a message." "Like a threatening one?" Tasha's eyes widened. "What? Are you serious? What did it say?" Brielle pulled out her phone and showed her the text. Tasha read it quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That guy is such a coward," she muttered. "Hiding behind a text because he can't handle being called out. You should report him." "To who?" Brielle asked, her voice laced with frustration. "The school. They'll just give him a slap on the wrist and tell me to ignore it. And if I go to my mom, she'll worry herself sick. I don't want to make it worse." Tasha crossed her arms, clearly unsatisfied with Brielle's response. "You can't just let him get away with this. He needs to know he can't intimidate you." Brielle appreciated Tasha's fierce loyalty, but the truth was, she didn't feel brave right now. The adrenaline that had fueled her confrontation earlier had faded, leaving behind only fear and doubt. She didn't want to admit it, even to herself, But Jason's text had shaken her more than she cared to admit. As they stood there, the hallway began to empty, the noise fading as students dispersed to their next classes. Tasha placed a hand on Brielle's shoulder, her voice softer now. Look, I know you're scared, and I get it. But you're not alone in this, okay? You've got me, and I know there are other people who support you too. Don't let him make you feel like you're on your own. Brielle nodded, though the words didn't fully sink in. She wanted to believe Tasha, to trust that she wasn't as isolated as she felt. But the fear clung to her, a shadow she couldn't shake. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Brielle went through the motions, attending her classes and nodding politely when teachers called on her, but her mind was elsewhere. The weight of the conflict with Jason loomed over her, casting a long shadow on everything else. By the time the final bell rang, she felt completely drained. As she walked home, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk. Brielle's thoughts churned, replaying the events of the day and the nagging feeling that something worse was coming. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice the figure leaning against the fence of the corner until she was almost past them. Brielle. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Turning slowly, she saw Jason standing there, his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face. He pushed off the fence and took a step toward her, his presence towering and invasive. What do you want? Brielle asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. Jason chuckled, a low, menacing sound. You've got a lot of nerve, talking to me like that in front of everyone. Thought I'd let you know it was a mistake. Brielle's fists clenched at her sides. It wasn't a mistake. You were out of line, and I wasn't going to just sit there and take it. Jason's smirk faltered for a moment, his jaw tightening. You think you're so tough, don't you? But you're just a nobody. You don't belong here, Brielle. People like you. People like me? Brielle interrupted, her voice rising despite herself. You mean people who won't let you bully them anymore. People who know their worth. You're right. I'm not like you, Jason, and thank God for that. Her words hung in the air, heavy and charged. For a moment, Jason said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he took another step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're going to regret this. Before Brielle could respond, Jason turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. She stood there for a long moment, her heart racing, her mind spinning. The confrontation had been brief, but the threat in his words was unmistakable. And for the first time, Brielle truly understood the depth of the conflict she was facing. The days that followed were anything but easy for Brielle. She tried to keep a brave face, moving through school as though Jason's words hadn't gotten under her skin. But every interaction felt heavier now, loaded with the threat of what might come next. The other students seemed to sense the tension too. Conversations grew quieter when Brielle entered a room, and her classmates exchanged glances that made her feel more watched than ever. Jason's presence loomed everywhere, even when he wasn't around. She would catch sight of him laughing with his friends across the cafeteria or lean casually against a locker, his gaze briefly locking with hers before she looked away. It wasn't just his physical presence. It was the way his influence seeped into everything, turning familiar spaces into battlefields where Brielle felt she had to be constantly on guard. One afternoon, Brielle sat in the library, a notebook open but blank in front of her. She was supposed to be working on an English essay, but her thoughts kept drifting. The words from their last confrontation played over and over in her mind, as if they were on a loop. You're going to regret this. Tasha's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. I've been looking for you everywhere, she said, sliding into the seat across from Brielle. Her face was serious, her tone low. We need to talk. Brielle glanced around nervously. What is it? Tasha hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, she leaned in closer. Jason's been talking, like to everyone. He's spreading all kinds of lies about you. Brielle's stomach tightened. What kind of lies? Tasha's expression was pained. He's saying you cheated on that history test last month, that you've been trash-talking people behind their backs, Stuff like that. None of it's true, obviously, but he's trying to turn everyone against you. Brielle's hands balled into fists under the table. It wasn't just Jason anymore. He was trying to poison her reputation, to isolate her completely. Why is he doing this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because he's scared, Tasha said firmly. You stood up to him, and he doesn't know how to handle it. So now he's trying to take you down the only way he knows how. Brielle wanted to believe Tasha, but didn't feel that simple. Every lie Jason told was another wound, another way to strip her of the confidence she'd fought so hard to hold on to. And the worst part was, she could see it working. People she used to talk to were now avoiding her in the hallways. Conversations stopped when she walked by. The walls were closing in, and she felt powerless to stop it. That evening, Brielle sat on her bed, her phone buzzing with notifications she didn't want to check. The texts and DMs had started coming in earlier, some supportive, but others cruel. Anonymous accounts sent her mocking messages and screenshots of group chats where her name was being dragged through the mud. It was overwhelming, suffocating. Her mom knocked softly on the door and peeked in. Hey, sweetie, you've been quiet today. Everything okay? Brielle hesitated, forcing a smile. Yeah, just a lot of homework. Her mom frowned, clearly not convinced, but she didn't press. Well, dinner's ready whenever you're hungry. After her mom left, Brielle let out a shaky breath. She didn't want to worry her, didn't want her to feel like she had to fix this for her. But as the weight of everything pressed down, Brielle felt more alone than ever. The next day at school, things reached a boiling point. As Brielle walked to her locker, she noticed a group of students gathered nearby, whispering and glancing in her direction. She tried to ignore them, focusing on swapping out her books for the next class. Then she saw it. A piece of paper taped to the front of her locker. Her heart sank as she pulled it off. In bold, black letters it read, "Know your place." The words were simple, but their message was loud and clear. Brielle's hands trembled as she crumpled the paper, her cheeks burning. She didn't have to look around to know Jason was behind it. She could almost hear his laughter, could feel the satisfaction he must have felt seeing her reaction. Before she could think too much, a voice broke through the silence. What's going on here? Brielle turned to see Mrs. Connors approaching, her sharp gaze sweeping over the group of students who had been watching. They scattered quickly, muttering excuses about being late for class. Brielle, Mrs. Connors asked, her tone softer now. Are you okay? Brielle hesitated, her grip tightening on the crumpled paper. Part of her wanted to brush it off, to tell Mrs. Connors it was nothing. But another part of her, the part that was tired of feeling small and powerless, wanted to speak up. I'm fine, she said finally, though her voice wavered. It's just nothing. Mrs. Connors didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me. Brielle nodded, grateful, but still unsure of what to do. As she walked to class, she felt the weight of the paper in her hand, its message seared into her mind. Later that day, Brielle found herself back in the library, seeking refuge from the chaos. She sat at a table near the window, staring out at the grey clouds gathering on the horizon. It felt fitting, like the weather was mirroring the storm brewing in her life. Tasha joined her a few minutes later, sliding into the seat across from her. I heard what happened at your locker, she said quietly. Are you okay? Brielle sighed, her shoulders slumping. I don't know. It's just getting to be too much. The messages, the lies, the notes, it feels like he's everywhere. Tasha reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You're stronger than he is, Brielle. Don't let him make you forget that. Brielle wanted to believe her friend, but the fear and doubt lingered. Jason's grip on the school felt unshakable, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand against him. But deep down, a small spark of determination remained. She had come this far, and she wasn't ready to give up just yet. As the day ended and the clouds opened up, sending rain pouring down, Brielle felt a shift within herself. The battle wasn't over, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let Jason win without a fight. The next day, Brielle walked into school with a faint sense of determination, clinging to Tasha's words like a lifeline. She wasn't sure what the day would bring, but she promised herself she would face it head-on. Yet as soon as she turned the corner to her locker, she knew things had taken an unexpected turn. A crowd had gathered, their murmurs echoing down the hallway. At the center of it all was Jason, flanked by his usual crew, holding something in his hand. Brielle's stomach churned as she approached cautiously. Jason's eyes lit up when he saw her, a smirk spreading across his face. "Well, look who decided to join us," he said loudly, drawing everyone's attention. He held up what appeared to be a printed photo. Brielle's heart sank when she recognized it. It was an old picture of her from middle school, taken during a class trip. Her skin looked darker in the harsh lighting, and the angle wasn't flattering. Jason had scrawled the words "too dark, too ugly" in red marker across the top. "Guess you missed the memo," Jason continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "This is what happens when you try to act like you're better than everyone else." He handed the photo to one of his friends, who immediately started passing it around. Brielle froze, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, their reactions ranging from pity to amusement. Her chest tightened, the humiliation nearly unbearable. But as much as she wanted to run away, something stopped her. The spark of determination from the day before flared up, stronger this time. She couldn't let him win, not like this. Taking a deep breath, Brielle stepped forward, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "You think this makes you powerful?" she asked, her gaze locking with Jason's. "All it shows is how small you really are." Jason's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "I'm just telling the truth," he said, his tone defiant. "It's not my fault if you can't handle it." "The truth," Brielle repeated, her voice growing stronger. "The truth is, you're scared. You're scared of anyone who doesn't bow down to you. And instead of facing your own insecurities, you try to tear other people down to feel better about yourself." The hallway fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut in. "She's right," a girl from the crowd said. It was Maya, one of Jason's former friends who had distanced herself from him a few months ago. "We've all seen it. You pick on people who stand up to you because you can't handle being challenged." Jason's face darkened. "Stay out of this, Maya," he snapped. But it was too late. Others in the crowd were murmuring their agreement, emboldened by Brielle's courage and Maya's support. But just as Brielle felt a flicker of hope, Jason played his next card. "Fine," he said, his voice cold. "If you all want to take her side, go ahead. But you might want to think twice before you trust her." He pulled out his phone and opened a video. "Check this out." The crowd pressed closer as the video played. It was a heavily edited clip of Brielle during a class discussion, taken out of context to make it seem like she was insulting her classmates. Jason had spliced together snippets of her words, twisting them into something cruel and unrecognizable. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the video ended, and Brielle felt the fragile support she'd just gained begin to crumble. "That's not real," she protested, her voice shaking. "He edited it to make me look bad." Jason shrugged, feigning innocence. "Believe what you want. The evidence speaks for itself." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Brielle felt panic rising in her chest. Just when she thought she had turned the tide, Jason had escalated the conflict to a whole new level. She looked around, searching for support, but even Tasha seemed uncertain, her brow furrowed as she watched the video again. Brielle's mind raced. She knew she had to act fast, but how could she prove the video was fake? And even if she could, would it be enough to repair the damage Jason had done? For the first time, she felt the full weight of his power, the way he could manipulate not just words, but people, twisting the truth to serve his own narrative. But even as doubt threatened to consume her, Brielle refused to back down. She didn't know how yet, but she was determined to expose Jason for who he really was. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of someone like Jason. The crowd began to disperse, the tension lingering in the air. Jason walked away with his friends, his smirk firmly in place. Brielle stood alone by her locker, the crumpled photo still in her hand. As she stared at it, a plan began to form in her mind. A way to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved to be heard. Brielle spent the next few days working in silence, her focus unwavering. She pored through every piece of evidence she could find, reaching out to classmates and even pulling from her own phone's gallery to compile anything that could expose Jason's manipulation. Her sleepless nights were fueled not just by anger, but by a fierce determination to reclaim her voice and set the record straight. She knew Jason thrived on fear, and the only way to break his grip was to shine a light on the truth. By the end of the week, she had assembled everything she needed. With the help of Tasha and Maya, who had come around after realizing the extent of Jason's deception, Brielle created a video of her own. In it, she methodically dismantled Jason's false narrative, pointing out the obvious cuts and edits in his video and providing the full context of her original class discussion. She added testimony from other classmates who had been victims of Jason's bullying, piecing together a damning portrait of his behavior. The video was uploaded to the school's unofficial social media page late Friday night. By Saturday morning, it had gone viral within their community. The comments section exploded with reactions, some expressing shock at Jason's audacity, others apologizing to Brielle for doubting her. The tide was turning, but Brielle knew the real test would come Monday morning at school. When she walked into the building, the air was thick with tension. Everywhere she went, students whispered and pointed, their expressions a mix of awe and guilt. Jason was nowhere to be seen, but Brielle wasn't surprised. She had heard from a friend that he was trying to spin the narrative yet again, claiming the video was an attack on his reputation. Still, for the first time in weeks, Brielle felt a sense of control. She wasn't hiding anymore. During lunch, a surprising announcement came over the loudspeaker. The principal's voice crackled, calling both Brielle and Jason to the office. As she made her way there, the hallways felt impossibly long, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what awaited her, but she knew she had to face it head-on. When she arrived, Jason was already there, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. The principal, Mr. Holden, looked between them, his expression stern but calm. "I've seen both of your videos," he began, his tone measured, "and I've spoken to several students about what's been happening." Jason immediately launched into his defense, his voice dripping with indignation. "This is ridiculous. She's just trying to ruin me because I called her out. Everyone knows she—" "Enough," Mr. Holden interrupted firmly. "This isn't a courtroom, Jason, and the evidence speaks for itself." Jason faltered, his face reddening. Brielle watched him, her own hands trembling slightly. Mr. Holden turned his attention to her. "Brielle, I'm sorry this has gone as far as it has. The school failed to address this earlier, and for that, I take responsibility. However, I also want to commend you for standing up for yourself in a situation where many would have stayed silent." Brielle nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure what to say, but before she could respond, Jason's voice cut through again. "This isn't fair. She's playing the victim." "Jason," Mr. Holden said sharply, his patience clearly wearing thin, "I suggest you take this time to reflect on your actions. Effective immediately, you are suspended, and further disciplinary measures will be considered based on the school board's review." Jason's jaw dropped, but no words came out. For the first time, Brielle saw something new in his eyes. Fear. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then she remembered all the times he had made her feel small, all the people he had hurt, and she knew this was justice. As Jason stormed out of the office, Brielle felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But just as she thought the ordeal was over, Mr. Holden leaned forward, his expression softening. "There's one more thing," he said, his tone almost cautious. "During my investigation, I discovered something unexpected." Brielle's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Mr. Holden hesitated for a moment before pulling out a small stack of papers. It seems Jason wasn't acting alone. Someone else was feeding him information and encouraging his behavior. And based on what I've found, it's someone you know. The room seemed to tilt as Brielle processed his words. She thought back to the moments when Jason had used details about her life that seemed oddly specific, things she hadn't shared with many people. A chill ran down her spine as a name came to mind, one she didn't want to believe. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Holden slid the papers across the desk, and Brielle's eyes widened as she recognized the handwriting. It couldn't be. But there it was, undeniable proof that someone she trusted had betrayed her. Brielle left the office that day with a bittersweet sense of closure. She had stood up to Jason, but the revelation of the betrayal left her reeling. She knew the battle wasn't over, but one thing was certain. She was no longer the girl who would shrink in the face of adversity. She had found her voice, and she was determined to use it.